This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I am your host, Richard McColl, here in London this month. Yes, I'm on holiday here in London. For the first time in 3 years, I visited the city in which I grew up. Our very special guest, well, he's been on the show, I think, a couple of times, or at least one time. He is a very renowned travel writer. In fact, we had him on before talking about Crossed Off the Map, and it was a book about Bolivia, an excellent book published by the Latin American Bureau, really going into some of the curiosities about Bolivia. And as I believe that we should be always extending the podcast into further afield within Latin America, it's fun to talk to Shafik about his latest book. But before we do that, Shafik, I'm gonna embarrass you a little bit. You shouldn't be embarrassed. This book, and we've done a lot of books this year so far, but it's called Small Earthquakes, A Journey Through Lost British History in South America. And it's the fascinating story of Britain's forgotten connections to South America. And you have reviews everywhere. The Times, The Observer, BBC Travel, Latin American Review of Books. And I'm just going to read the BBC Travel one, and then you can stop blushing and we can talk about it. The passion and poignancy of his prose is captured in his description, combining the immediacy of a travel memoir with the depth of scholarly history lesson. Small Earthquakes illuminates how Britain helped shape these nations. BBC Travel. So first and foremost, Shafik, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Richard. Obviously, I'm blushing almost entirely across my face at the moment. So thank you very much. Lovely to be back on. Lovely to be talking to you in London, as well. And looking forward to talking to you about Small Earthquakes.
It's just great. It's just great, and you should your ears should be burning, and you should be proud of this because you are doing, I think, a service to readers and people even with an inkling of interest in Latin America. So tell us a little bit of how this book came about.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken in the past about my love of South America, which came from no connections to the continent, but just as a childhood, loving South American footballers, Carlos Valderrama being one of them, Maradona and so on, Batistuta, loving documentaries about the Amazon, loving learning about ancient civilizations such as the Inca, and that's what drew me to the continent originally. Some 20 years ago, this year, in fact, when I was just a backpacker before I did any travel writing, and that trip had a seismic impact on my career. It prompted me to become a travel writer. And everywhere I went, when I was doing guidebooks, when I was doing features, I kept coming across these unexpected fragments of British history, these unusual connections, these larger-than-life characters. Everywhere I went. Rubber traders in the Amazon with houses in Hampstead, a cemetery of abandoned British trains on the edge of the Salar de Uyuni, the world's biggest salt flat, in Bolivia. Obviously, Welsh-speaking community in Argentine, Patagonia. And slowly it kind of came to me, I thought, well, this isn't a history that I'd learned about in school. It's not something that I really see represented in popular culture, certainly in the UK, right? We often see our relationship with Latin America is a distant place, no relevance to us, other than when the World Cup comes around or when bombastic politicians start banging the drum about the Falklands and Argentina. And that, but over the last kind of two decades, I just found out actually there's a really rich and long history spanning almost 500 years, and that Britain has had a seismic impact on South America as a whole, but particularly the south of South America, so Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, and these countries have also had a seismic impact on Britain as well, but just people, particularly in this country, don't know this history. So the book aims to put that right by through my travels to some of the most dramatic places on Earth.
And okay, I've got so many questions, but explain to my readers the genesis of Small Earthquakes as a title.
Yeah, so small earthquakes. This is something. Before I became a travel writer, I was a news and sports reporter here in London for the Evening Standard, and I did my journalism course. And while I was doing that, I heard mention one of the lecturers mentioned this story from the 1920s in the Times newsroom, and apparently sub editors on those long evening shifts had a game to pass the time, which was to come up with the dullest headline that made it into print in the next day's paper. And according to one of them, Claude Coburn, who's a fascinating character, incidentally, according to him, he once won this competition with the headline, "Small earthquake in Chile, not many dead." Now, for the record, I need to say that this is almost certainly an apocryphal story. No edition of the paper is actually carrying that headline, has actually been found. But it's entered Fleet Street folklore, right? It's very familiar with to many journalists here in the UK. And for me, it seems to sum up a British attitude to South America that was a distant place of little consequence to us. And as I mentioned earlier, that it really didn't chime with my experiences in the continent. So really, it's so the title of the book is a playful a twist on that story. And actually, I introduced the book through that, but the rest of the book is showing that actually that couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, I see a similarity between small earthquakes and the title "Crossed Off the Map" as well. These kind of these stories from folklore, and Crossed Off the Map, of course, is Queen Victoria. Is it Queen Victoria who crosses Bolivia off the map?
Yeah, supposedly. I mean, like so much of British involvement in South America, a lot of it is shrouded in myths and legends and tall stories and so on. But supposedly, it was the British ambassador or British diplomatic figure in La Paz upset the Bolivian president in the mid-19th century, Mariano Melgarejo, who another interesting character we don't really have time to go into today, but look it up. Angered him, and he got very annoyed and stripped the ambassador naked, tied him to the back of a donkey facing the back naturally, paraded him around one of the plazas in La Paz, and then kicked him out of the country. When word of this reached Queen Victoria, supposedly she was so angry that she asked for a map and crossed Bolivia's name off of it and said Bolivia doesn't exist. Now, again, this is another apocryphal story. There's lots of theories about where it might have originated. Probably in Chile, which obviously has a fractious relationship with Bolivia, to say the least. But again, it's another one of those stories that really seem to kind of highlight, I'd say, like an ignorance of South America in Britain, and also kind of often a slightly dismissive attitude that there is a relatively new phenomenon, right? Go back to the 19th century, go back to the early 20th century, and it was very different, including in Bolivia and across the continent.
See, I love it. I love you pulling these stories out and displaying them for all to read. All of you must read these things. But I think there's so much in. I mean, let's say your focus in this book, Small Earthquakes, is the southern cone, Argentina, Chile. Of course, Chile and the United Kingdom have a very close relationship, and it goes up to, I would say, even the present day. Argentina was a lot closer before certain geopolitical activities there in the South Atlantic. And Uruguay is a curious one. And I just sort of wanted to bring it up because Uruguay, I absolutely love Uruguay. I mean, just one of those things. It just really appeals to me. But you go into the cemetery in Montevideo, and you start saying, and you even mentioned there's a McColl there with an ALL and I'm an OLL, but I saw that too. And actually just on the left-hand side on the way in, there's a Nielsen as well. So both of my surnames are in there, which has led me to believe we must have been, merchant mariners back in the day. What does it feel like each time that you sort of uncover? Because what it is, I've traveled the continent a lot, and I continually bore my family that I have to sort of peel away and go into a cemetery And I wouldn't impress that on anyone else because I've just walked down Brompton Cemetery this morning, but you peel away and you start seeing, like in Brazil, up towards Salvador, in Salvador de Bahia, there's a British cemetery right there, and in Brazil. And how does it feel when you step into these places? Because it's kind of a vestige of empire, but not empire as we think of it, like India or Jamaica or Nigeria type thing. How do you let's say react?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very similar to you in that I find it difficult to pass a cemetery without popping in, and it's not just a macabre interest. These are often beautiful places, but they always tell a story about the history of the place that you're visiting, and particularly the British cemeteries. There's one in Buenos Aires, there's one in Montevideo, and that really tells the story. It brings up the story, and as you can see, you can often find kind of potential links to home. And I'm glad you mentioned Uruguay, because it's a country that I love. It's often overlooked within South America, as the misfortune of being wedged in between, obviously two
great destinations,
two great destinations, two large, boisterous, countries. But again, Montevideo has always been an important port from a geopolitical point of view. And if you walk around it today, the British Cemetery obviously speaks about the British history there. If you go down to the Naval Museum, then you can learn about the sinking of the Graf Spee, which was the first major naval battle of the Second World War. And a huge part of kind of British British naval involvement in that conflict. And then in some ways this history is hiding in plain sight. If you walk along it's got an incredible corniche along the coastline, the Rambler. But you pass on to it and you say, okay, well this stretch is named Gran Bretagna. It's named. And then you say, okay, that looks like an Anglican church. There's an Anglican church there. If you look up the railway station, you see sculptures of George Stephenson on the side of it. Football is obviously a huge, a huge, in some ways the most significant kind of relic of British influence in South America as a whole, particularly on the River Plate. So many of the famous teams had British either inspiration or British founders. Peñarol, one of the most successful teams in Latin American or South American history, right? A railway team, and that's kind of been the connection between railway and football, and the British influence is so evident. And then obviously elsewhere in Uruguay you have the town and the former meatpacking plant of Fray Bentos, right? One of the most famous British food brands of the 20th century, a place that changed the way we eat, the way the world eats. But it's now like a sleepy little town on the river, and it's and the old meatpacking plant is somewhat improbably a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the slightly unlikely tourist destination. But it still remains a cultural touchstone, both in Uruguay and in the UK today. So it's just been part of the pleasure of the book has just been unraveling some of these stories and kind of showing that they're still relevant today.
Yeah, definitely. I just love. I mean, I absolutely love it. Do you know? Because you are obviously you were a sports writer previous to your travel writing. And it's outside of the sphere of the Southern Cone. It's Brazil. But what was the international team that the first Brazilian national side played against? Do you know this?
I've got the name ringing in the back of my head. It's an unlikely team, isn't it?
Very unlikely.
It's not Exeter City.
It is exactly
Exeter
City.
So
1938. and they traveled down. Why Exeter City? I know this, of course, because I went to university down there. And over time, their return was delayed by the ship going back up the Atlantic because of World War II. They had to do
Brilliant.
circles.
It's incredible. I mean, I'm a Liverpool supporter, so inevitably in the book I had to write about the other Liverpool, which is in Montevideo, which is in the last few years has also won won a league title as well, and of course Everton, which is the South American Merseyside derby, which is Liverpool and Everton. The UK version's very close together, famously. Even with Everton moving to a new stadium. The South American version's much further apart. I mean, they've got the Andes in between them, from Liverpool in Montevideo in Uruguay and Everton in Viña del Mar on the Pacific coast. So it's kind of these are fun stories, and that's often you see the kind of the rivalries, the old geopolitical tensions, obviously particularly with Argentina, but not just with Argentina, play out on the football field. I mean, one of the things I liked when I was in Buenos Aires, which is still a popular chant at Argentine national games, and also kind of in domestic competitions, is if you don't jump, if you don't bounce, you're an Englishman. And so and the whole crowd, sometimes the players as well, will be jumping up and down, bouncing up and down. And
I did not know this one. I did not know that at all. I probably jumped up and down to it at a game, at Boca Juniors, without even knowing, being unaware of this. I like, obviously, the connection that we see. Excuse me. A lot of the connection that we see, obviously, are linked to ports and railways, and that was one of the main exports. But of course, it goes way back before that, even into periods of time. If we look at the Southern Cone independence, you've got British. What would you call them? Retirees from the Napoleonic Wars, who are, we like to, from a Eurocentric perspective, think of them as glorious men fighting for the independence, for helping newly emerging, well, let's say European states within South America throw off the shackles of Spanish imperialism and their yoke. But of course, they were, so many of them were glory hunters looking for whatever they could, and they had no other options, or they were press ganged into it. But it's so interesting to see those things. But if we bring it up to a bit more presently, I know there's a book out, and I'm going to buy it. I'm going to go today, I think, about Londres Street or London Street in Santiago, Chile. Santiago. Can you tell us a bit about that, the history of this street?
Yeah, so I think it's Philip Sands who's got the book out about it, which I haven't read yet, but it's on my reading list. Scroll back, I don't know, to the early 2010s, and I was working as one of the co-authors of the Rough Guide to Chile, and then as now, guidebooks were not the best paid form of employment, but a brilliant way to travel. Yes. Anyway, so I was looking for some cheap digs to stay in Santiago while I was there, and I ended up in the Paris Laundress district, tiny little neighborhood just off the main street in the city centre. Beautiful, right? Yeah. Cobbled street, really nice. There's some nice bars there. It's architecturally nice, just in like a very an inexpensive hotel. And I happened to be just coincidentally, and I didn't realise it at the time, opposite a building called Londres 38, which was under the Pinochet dictatorship, was one of the clandestine torture and detention centres. There were many in across Chile, and obviously this kind of issue was wider. You saw it in Argentina and Brazil and so on. And so I learned the history. I was able to visit. It became a site of memory, as they call it, so that you can actually visit. There's information on it at the excellent Santiago Museum of Human Rights as well. yeah, but there, there are links. I mean, in some ways, the Londra Street was that was coincidental, but there
Hmm.
was a lot of support, famously from the US Secret Services for Pinochet, but also from Britain, both at the time of the coup and throughout the Pinochet dictatorship. And famously, kind of in the 1990s, after the return of democracy, when Pinochet came to seek medical treatment, and then it became another of these geopolitical
Hmm.
incidents, and that was because of it's tangled, murky history, but kind of was another illustration of the close British
Hmm.
relationship with Chile that dates back obviously to the Falklands War, dates
Hmm.
back to the 1960s, and kind of efforts to how should we put it, undermine left wing and trade union movements in not just in Chile but beyond. And
Hmm.
but further back, it was all the way back to the Napoleon, just after the Napoleonic Wars, when thousands and thousands of British soldiers are demobbed and in need of
Hmm.
employment, and Simon Bolivar obviously came over. Representatives came over, recruited. British weaponry was also important. And I know famously in Colombia that they had the British battalions had a key role. In Chile, if you go anywhere in Chile, from Arica in the Atacama Desert down to Punta Arenas on the Strait of Magellan, you'll find a statue of Thomas Cochrane, or you'll find a street named after him, or you'll find a plaza. And he was a British naval officer, another
Hmm.
one with an interesting story that we dip into in the book, who basically founded the Chilean Navy,
Hmm.
helped the country win its independence from Spain. And then later helped Brazil do the same
Yeah.
from Portugal, and Greece from the Ottoman Empire before he returned to the UK. But he's a national hero,
Yeah.
a national hero, alongside obviously Bernardo O'Higgins, whose
That's
name
right.
obviously implies his Irish heritage. But he, every school children learn about it.
Hmm.
A very familiar name across the country. You come to the UK,
Nothing.
that story, and he's just the example of it, because there were many thousands of particularly naval officers, but soldiers who played an important part. The rose-tinted view is, they were motivated by freedom and democracy and liberty and all of that kind of stuff. But obviously the truth was, there was a wide range of motivations, and some were just mercenaries, some were just seeking adventure, some were kind of press ganged into it.
Mm.
Um, but again, that's history. That history is very, very evident today.
You'd be hard pushed to really prove that yes, all of these efforts were made altruistically. They were made with gains in mind, and then of course British interests, banks, and so on, and the quest for natural goods, timber, coal, what have you, guano. I mean, you mention it, don't you? You talk about Easter Island, or Isla de Pascua, out there, way out there, basically in Polynesia, but a Chilean island.
Yeah. So Easter Island, Rapa Nui, that was somewhere as a kid I was fascinated by,
Mm.
and one of the reasons why was I was taken by my parents to the British Museum, and I
Oh,
saw, as a kid, and I saw my first moai, my first Easter Island statue in the flesh, and I was captivated with it, as visitors continue to be to this day. And then, scroll forward several decades, and my work as a guidebook author, luckily enough, took me to Easter Island on many occasions, and people just, it's people know remoteness. It's the most, it's the remotest inhabited place on the planet, and they know the statues, and sometimes I think of kind of the ecocide theory, a theory that has been widely debunked, I should say, but that's going off on a tangent. But there's also this tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific, a long way from Britain, obviously a long way from anywhere, nevertheless has really strong British connections, to the point that possibly a British pirate may have been the first European to spot the island, but certainly Captain Cook and his crew visited the island in the early days. And then there were, during the 19th century, when a series of kind of rapacious kind of European ranchers essentially operated the whole island as a giant sheep ranch, and essentially kept the indigenous Rapa Nui people, hemmed in probably what we would call today a concentration camp. And several of them had British links, including a famous Chilean-based Scottish company, Balfour Williamson, and that kind of lasted all the way, kind of into the middle of the 20th century before essentially Chile took direct control, and it was only in the 60s that that the Rapa Nui people got Chile, got the right to vote in Chilean national elections, for example. I was lucky enough to kind of be able to explore this wonderful place, tell a bit of this story, and part of which was as you say, guano, which is essentially seabird drop-ins, which in the late 19th century was one of the most important fertilizers globally. It was an incredibly valuable commodity. Essentially, during the Industrial Revolution, it enabled European countries to produce enough food for their growing populations, and the largest reserves on Earth of this were islands off the Pacific coast of particularly Peru, but kind of now what's now also northern Chile, but was often part of Bolivia at the time. And that these were huge mounds of this this material that was essentially mined, and essentially Peruvian slave traders travelled to Rapa Nui and other parts of Polynesia, and enslaved the indigenous members of the indigenous population, forced them to toil in these these appalling conditions alongside indentured workers from China, alongside conscripts and prisoners, and horrific conditions. And the company, you can probably see where this is going, the company that had the monopoly on the export of this very valuable commodity was a British company with long-standing interests in South America. And it was, Anthony Gibbs, who was kind of the head of the company, was one of the richest men in the UK at the time. Off the back of this trade, and then kind of that was later superseded by kind of another very valuable resource, nitrate from the Atacama Desert, which again was used for the same purpose as well as for the manufacture of explosives, and that kind of the late 19th and early 20th century that replaced guano. So these commodities had a seismic impact on the world that we live in today. But often for some reason the stories weren't really being told outside of kind of academic books.
We do not learn about this. There's no, and of course history is being obviously cut in schools in the UK and so on, and being seen as more as a hobby than a necessity, I would say. And or if you do history, of course, it's of the great daring do of the Spitfire squadrons in World War II, or of course the Raj in India, or what have you. It's really not. We don't think of Latin America as somewhere that the Brits had a lot of influence, but for example, from my perspective in Colombia, and the late great historian Malcolm Days, who said, as a Colombianologist, I believe you'd say, he said there was a small community of Brits in Colombia, but they were so powerful economically. They really were. You mentioned Stevenson earlier on. Well, Stevenson from the north of England, his son put in mines in Colombia. He put in the rails for tin mines. We have all number of people from the British Legion in the British Cemetery, about which I'm doing the book. Nice little plug there. But something came up when you were talking and how you were fascinated seeing the Moai, the head statue there in the British Museum. How do you feel about that? Because it obviously inspired you. I saw it in the British Museum and have been lucky enough to go to Isla Pascua or Rapa Nui. Is it time for the return? Is it time for us to return these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think in these situations, I bow to the views of the people of the culture that produced these items. I absolutely loved seeing it as a kid in the museum. But there's a strong there's a strong repatriation movement both on Easter Island and also in Chile as a whole, calling for the return of this specific Moai. British Museum actually has two statues, one of which is on permanent display. The famous one is on permanent display. Another one is often in storage, right? So which is another issue. But the one that people in the UK will be very familiar with is a particularly significant Moai. It has incredible carvings on its back that depict the Birdman contest, which was for kind of circa 150 years a way of deciding political authority on the island. It's made from a different material than the majority of statues. So it's a particularly significant Moai. Now, obviously, the carving of the statues is part of a form of ancestor worship.
Yeah,
they look inwards. They're situated kind of near water sources around villages, looking over the Rapa Nui people and providing protection when needed. And I'm going to have to paraphrase this quote because I don't recall it exactly, but one of kind of a member of the kind of like one of the local councils on Rapa Nui compared the British Navy taking this Moai and gifting it to Queen Victoria, who then gifted it, re-gifted it to the British Museum, as akin to taking one of our grandfathers and sticking it in their living rooms, right? As and I thought, one, that's a great quote, but it's kind of it helps to sum it up. So there's ongoing calls, right from the top, from the Chilean president, down to the people on Rapa Nui, for the return of this particular Moai. I mean, the other thing is, people often just see the statues as the only, as the only significant element of Rapa Nui culture, which couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, there's also these tablets which look a bit like cricket bats without a handle, which have a script called Rongo Rongo on them, which is one of the only languages to develop independently in Oceania. These are even rarer than the statues. I think there's 1,000+ statues, 900 or so of which are still on the island. But these, there's fewer than 30 of these tablets, which are held in museums all over the world. If you go to the excellent museum on Easter Island today, you can see replicas of these tablets, but none of the originals. Right? You can see them in Santiago, the originals, or elsewhere. So there's also calls for the return of some of these items too. But I think at the very least, hopefully someone will, readers will take from the book that when they go to the British Museum, and see this incredible, one of the wonders of the world, this statue, that they'll also have a better idea of how it ended up there in the first place and why it's such a significant item.
I mean, these stories. I tend to go with the feelings of the locals There is a time. There is a time for these things, and things have their cycles. That's what I genuinely try to focus on. If I move on a little bit, again, we come back to everything comes back to British dominance on the high seas. Let's say Valparaiso, when you go there and you realize in Chile how significant that port is, and of course for the gold rush coming all the way around, and that puts the Falklands into perspective, or the Malvinas, and puts them. They had consuls there, for international consuls on the island, because of that long trip round the point all the way up to San Francisco for the gold rush. It puts it into perspective what the era meant geopolitically, and I think therein lays the importance. It's not just a British history; it's very much a global history, and that's how it all sort of fits together in this puzzle. There was something that bounced out at me there as well, but I was kind of thinking about the old portraits, the paintings. I think I can't remember if it's a Peruvian painting that I may have seen in Iquitos or somewhere like that, of the battle of the War of the Pacific, and it's the Peruvian admiral was General Grau, I think, and in the background you've got the Chilean Navy taking on the Peruvian Navy, but in the background you can see the flags flying of the Union Jack. I mean, really very involved in this. And when you were mentioning Pinochet, and I remember when he was sort of under house arrest in Sunningdale, just outside near to Ascot. But I remember when he was in house arrest, and you had the one side outside clamoring and banging drums and so on for his release, and the other side of the road banging for him to be, not. I guess it was Baltasar. Was it Baltasar Garzón?
I believe so.
Yeah, probably. The very, very prevalent human rights lawyer, and all power to him. And then of course Jack Straw, who was the foreign minister at the time, dilly-dallying. I mean, it was months, and then Margaret Thatcher almost coming out of retirement and visiting him the whole time. It was a big deal. It was a big deal, but it goes to show the closeness Chile and United Kingdom, Great Britain, and of course the Chile at that point, when it was the Falklands conflict, the Malvinas conflict, suggesting that they could Pinochet send his troops to the Argentine border to draw away some of the Argentine forces. I mean, these are big connections.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the kind of sharing of kind of military intelligence from, particularly from a Chilean base in Punta Arenas, which is a city in the far south of Patagonia on the Strait of Magellan, and kind of tacit support. Obviously, Chile and Argentina have often had a fractious relationship. The border in between Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego has, almost brought them to the verge of, conflict in the past. Ironically, occasionally Britain playing a mediating role, and another influence for the present border between the two countries in Patagonia is the presence of the Welsh community, Welsh speaking Argentine community in that area, who kind of voted to stay on the Argentine side, even though probably strictly in terms of in the way these things are decided, that quite valuable part of land should have fallen to Chile. But yeah, it kind of underlines the strong military and naval relationships between the two. And obviously that dates back to the 19th century, when the British Empire was at its height. British sea power was at its height. Britain, was a bit like Chinese investment across the world is spoken about today. That was akin to the British role in South America and obviously beyond at the time. And the Pacific ports in Chile were hugely important. Obviously Valparaiso, which is basically central Chile, not too far from Santiago, called the Jewel of the Pacific, one of the most important ports in the Americas. during the California Gold Rush, and the push west of the the frontier of the United States, hugely important, and an incredible number of trading ships poured into that country, and then the aforementioned natural resources from Chile, such as nitrate, kind of often shipped out the other way. And that attracted a hugely wealthy multinational cast of merchants and investors and adventurers and settlers and so on, many of whom were British, and they settled on these two of Valparaiso's famous hills, which encircle the port like an amphitheatre. And if you walk around them today, obviously the street names, you're off street and business names, you'll see have a British and often German kind of feel to them. And then you'll look at these kind of, Victorian, Edwardian era houses with their, sash windows and their neatly tended rose gardens at the front. Beautiful, very, very photogenic. And this is where the upper echelons of the British community would live, and they could gaze out over to one of the busiest ports in the Americas and see, a steady stream of British ships coming in and out. Valparaiso, the good times came to an end in the early 20th century. First, a devastating earthquake, and then the opening of the Panama Canal, which obviously provides a handy shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and plunged the city into the doldrums, and also helped to kind of it helped to disperse the kind of the British community there. But the legacy is still very evident today. We spoke about cemeteries, our joint passion for cemeteries earlier. It's got an incredible cemetery in Valparaiso, and you see this history there, right, in the names of the tombs. Lots of British names, but also kind of emphasize lots of British Spanish, British Italian, British French. You see the integration and the assimilation of the community there as well. And obviously the legacy was left in a sporting context, but also you saw that people gradually became part of became Chileans, as migrants do kind of around the world. And kind of that was also one of the stories that I wanted to tell, that immigration is a fevered topic of discussion in the UK today. There's often a lot of prejudice and misinformation about it, and kind of one of the things that that this book tells is that Britain has been a country of migration as well. Like this huge thousands, tens of thousands of Britons, migrated for all manner of reasons, but often just seeking new opportunities, seeking freedom from prejudice, seeking riches, and many other good and bad motivations. And with a legacy that lives on today. The Welsh community in Patagonia is probably the most famous, the most iconic version of that, but by no means the only one. Buenos Aires in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, was home to one of the biggest British communities, or often colonies, as they styled themselves, outside of the British Empire. And when I lived in the city, a few years back, near my apartment in Villa Crespo, there were streets named Darwin and Fitzroy and Thames, and the English language Buenos Aires Herald was for sale on the newsstands. And when I went for my sins to Calle Florida, which is like the main shopping street, a bit like Oxford's Street, I guess, and then you walk down and you see, it's a Harrods.
That's right.
Harrods store that's shuttered and crumbling, and when I went last year, kind of infested with pigeons.
Oh.
And and there used to be a great cafe called the Cafe Richmond as well. So you suddenly is all of those kind of stories are still evident today, and it speaks to not just British investment, but British settlement in this part of the world, and obviously and in many ways the Irish settlement throughout this period equally momentous as well. And you say there's still British honorary consuls all
Yes.
across the world. Lucky to meet them on Easter Island, in Valparaiso, in Punta Arenas. There's quite an organised British community in or Anglo-Argentine community, I should say, in Buenos Aires. There's a British cemetery there as well, so it's a lot of it is delving into the history, but it's also showing that this is a living history, and it's a relationship that kind of continues to this day. Also here in the UK, Latin Americans, from across the region are one of the fastest growing, migrant groups in the country. It's always difficult getting exact up-to-date figures, but I think, circa 250,000 people in the UK. And I'm speaking to you from South London. South London has got a big Latin American, British Latin American community. And I can, without having to travel too far, I can get some empanadas. I can get, cazuela. I can get, papusas, all kinds of, and food is obviously,
yes,
an obvious example of that. But actually, it's just one of the most obvious signs that this is an ongoing and developing relationship.
I like this. I like this element on migration, of course, both ways. Just off the record, we're walking up to the tube station the other day, and we heard a Colombian maestro talking to Central American workers stripping paint back off the house, and I was just like, this, a few years ago, this wouldn't have been. It would be Poles or Eastern Europeans of some sort, and so it's fascinating to watch. My final sort of comment, if you have any thoughts on it, is that in Colombia, well, let's say the northern part of South America, Venezuela had far more British interest, Ecuador not so much, Colombia not so much, very powerful, but not so much. And I've run into people of, I would say, working class backgrounds with British surnames, and I've asked them if they knew about the history, and no idea at all, no idea. And so I talked to them, your surname is Blackburn. He was driving a taxi. Blackburn, do you know about that? And he said, yeah, someone mentioned something that my grandparents or my great grandparents from over there, but what good is that for me? Did you ever come across any people like that in your travels?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see people's surnames are often a very a shorthand to telling this story. And yes, and some people are familiar with it. I remember a conversation at a food market in Buenos Aires with someone who was very proudly telling me about their heritage from Newcastle, kind of dating back a couple of generations. So some people are very familiar with it. I mean, I often in Argentina and Chile, I found that people are very familiar with it.
Yes,
but often people aren't necessarily aware of their heritage, right? It dates back several years, and surnames are pronounced differently. They're being Hispanicized a little bit. So yeah, so constantly, and again, my girlfriend is Welsh and a Welsh speaker, and when she's been to Patagonia, the only the Chubut, the northeastern part, which is where the bulk of the Welsh community settled and lived, and you meet lots of kind of Alejandro Jones, and that kind of stuff. Jones, obviously, quite difficult, difficult name to pronounce in Spanish. But so you find lots of those kind of connections, and but some people are very familiar with them, and but others are not. And but when I've spoken to people who who aren't so familiar with, they're often kind of quite interested to see kind of the heritage. The heritage dating back, and kind of, it offers a bit of a window into their own family past.
Well, thank you so much, Shafik, for this opportunity. Everyone, please go out and buy Small Earthquakes. It's released on the 31st of July. You can get it everywhere. Every good bookshop has it stocked widely, and of course, if you must, it's on Amazon too, and all the other online outlets. I'm just going to read what the Times wrote, I think in the last day or so. Let's end on this. This is travel writing as much as history. Meghji has the true travel writer's eye for the comic, pathetic, and tragic, and for the places where they collide. This is writing full of rust, wind, and sadness. It captures splendidly the air of South America and the long withdrawing roar of an empire whose influence once reached far beyond its political borders. That's from the Times. So again, congratulations, and I know it's going to be a great success.
Oh well, thank you very much for the kind words, Richard. It's always a pleasure chatting to you about this, and so thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
We'll get you back on, and once you are a best-selling author and you have no time for us. So thank you.
I will always make time for you. I'll always make time for you, Richard.
So check out. You can always find Shafik is prolific. Books, articles. You find him in geographical, wanderlust, guidebook writing, wherever. I mean, he's a prolific writer. So we've been talking to Shafik Meghji in south of the river. I'm north of the river. It's been an absolute pleasure. Small earthquakes. Look for it in your local bookstore. This has been the Colombia Calling podcast. I've been Richard McColl. Remember to sign up on patreon.com/Colombia Calling and support us there. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.